Welcome back, gentle traveler, to another peaceful journey through the rich tapestry of Elder Scrolls lore. I'm honored to guide you once more as we explore the ancient histories and diverse cultures that have shaped the world of Tamriel. This is Elder Scrolls lore to sleep to, where we uncover the profound stories of this beloved universe in a way designed to help you relax, unwind, and perhaps drift into peaceful slumber. In our previous journeys together, we have traveled from the very moment of creation itself, the eternal dance of Anu and Padome that gave birth to all existence. We have explored the mysterious Elder Scrolls, those artifacts of impossible knowledge that contain all possible pasts and futures within their shifting patterns. And we have contemplated the cosmic architecture of the towers, those monumental structures that serve as the very anchors of reality, maintaining the stability of the mortal plane through their metaphysical presence. Tonight, we turn our attention to some of the most ancient and influential inhabitants of Tamriel, the elven races, or Mer as they call themselves in their own tongues. These are the children of the stars, beings whose very essence carries within it the memory of spiritual realms beyond the mortal plane, whose long lives span centuries and whose perspectives encompass the rise and fall of empires that humans might know only through dusty chronicles. In this episode, Children of the Stars, we will explore the remarkable story of how a single people, the ancient Aldmer, gave rise to the diverse elven cultures that continue to shape Tamriel to this day. We will discover how philosophical differences, geographical migrations, and profound spiritual transformations led to the emergence of the proud Aldmer with their pursuit of perfection, the adaptable Dunmer with their complex relationship to gods and ancestors, the nature-bound Bosmer with their fluid understanding of form and identity, the tragic Falmer whose nobility was corrupted into something terrible, and the Orsimer whose very existence speaks to the power of divine transformation. Each of these elven peoples represents not merely a different culture, but a different answer to fundamental questions about existence. What does it mean to live a life that spans centuries? How should beings who remember their divine origins relate to the limitations of mortal existence? What is the proper relationship between stability and change, between preservation and adaptation, between the individual and the community? As we embark on this exploration, I invite you to settle comfortably wherever you are. Perhaps you're lying in bed, ready for sleep, or resting in a quiet place where you can let your mind wander through the ancient forests of Valunwood, the crystalline spires of Somerset Isle, or the ash-swept landscapes of Morrowind. Allow your body to find its natural position of ease, releasing any tension you might be carrying from the day's activities. Take a few gentle breaths, feeling the rhythm of your breathing slow and deepen. With each exhalation, let go of any urgency or restlessness. There is no need to hurry through these stories or to memorize every detail like the elven peoples themselves, who measure time in centuries rather than years. We can afford to move through this exploration with patience and contemplation, allowing each insight to settle naturally into awareness. The elven races we'll encounter tonight embody different approaches to one of the most fundamental challenges any conscious being faces: how to live with wisdom and purpose across the span of an extended lifetime. While human cultures often focus on achieving goals within the brief decades of mortal existence, elven societies have developed philosophies and practices designed to remain meaningful across centuries of experience. This long perspective brings both gifts and challenges. The gift is a deep understanding of patterns and cycles, an appreciation for gradual development and refinement, a capacity to see beyond the immediate circumstances to the larger currents that shape history. The challenge is the risk of becoming so detached from immediate concerns that one loses touch with the vitality and urgency that gives life its meaning, or conversely, becoming so burdened by accumulated experience and memory that change becomes impossible. Different elven cultures have found different ways to navigate this challenge. Some have embraced tradition and sought to preserve ancient wisdom across the generations. Others have emphasized adaptation and evolution, allowing their cultures to change and develop over time. Still others have sought transcendence, attempting to move beyond the limitations of material existence entirely. Each approach has its own wisdom and its own pitfalls, its own achievements and its own sorrows. As we explore these different paths tonight, you might find yourself reflecting on how these ancient questions relate to your own life and experience. How do we balance preservation with change? How do we maintain connection to our roots while remaining open to growth and transformation? How do we find meaning and purpose, not just in the immediate moment, but across the longer arc of our lives? The stories of the elven races offer no simple answers to these questions, but they provide rich material for contemplation. In the Altmer quest for perfection, we see both the nobility of high standards and the potential dangers of inflexibility. In the Dunmer embrace of change and conflict, we witness both the vitality that comes from facing challenges and the suffering that can result from constant upheaval. In the Bosmer connection to natural cycles, we observe both the wisdom of living in harmony with larger patterns and the risks of losing individual agency. Tonight's journey will take us across vast spans of time, from the mysterious homeland of Aldmeris to the contemporary politics of the Fourth Era. We will witness migrations that span continents, transformations that reshape entire peoples, and philosophical developments that continue to influence how the various races of Tamriel understand themselves and their place in the world. We will learn about the Dawn-era exodus that brought the first elves to Tamriel, and how their interactions with the land itself shaped their development. We will explore the great schisms that divided the early Aldmer into distinct populations, each following its own vision of what elven existence should become. We will contemplate the role of divine intervention in shaping elven destiny, from the Tribunal's transformation of the Chimera into the Dunmer, to Bothire's corruption of Trinamak into Malakath, and the birth of the Orsimer. We will also consider how the different elven races have related to the cosmic forces we explored in our previous episodes. How did the Altmer's devotion to crystal-like lore reflect their cultural values? How did the Dunmer's connection to Red Mountain and the heart of Lorcan influence their development? How do the elven approaches to time, prophecy, and metaphysical truth differ from those of human cultures? These are not merely academic questions, but living issues that continue to shape the political and cultural landscape of Tamriel. The rise of the Aldmeri dominion, the ongoing tensions between the Empire and various elven factions, the complex relationships between different elven peoples themselves. All of these contemporary dynamics have their roots in the ancient histories and philosophical differences we will explore tonight. So now, with mind at ease and body relaxed, let us begin our exploration of these remarkable peoples, the children of the stars, whose ancient wisdom and enduring conflicts continue to shape the destiny of Tamriel. Let us discover how a single people became many, how unity gave way to diversity, and how each branch of the great elven tree has grown in its own direction, while still sharing common roots in the distant past. Chapter 1. The Aldmer and the Exodus. From from Aldmeris. In the midst of the Dawn era, when the boundaries between time and eternity were still fluid, when the wounds of creation were still fresh, and the very nature of existence remained malleable, there lived upon a continent called Aldmeris a people known as the Aldmer, the first folk, the elder ones, the original children of the Etada, who had chosen to experience mortality rather than maintain their pure spiritual existence. The exact nature of Aldmeris remains one of the greatest mysteries in Elder Scrolls lore, shrouded in the peculiar uncertainties that characterize all Dawn era history. Some traditions describe it as a physical continent that once existed somewhere in the vast oceans beyond Tamriel, perhaps to the southwest, where only empty waters now remain. Others suggest that Aldmeris was never truly a place in the conventional sense, but rather a state of being, a collective condition of the early Aldmer that transcended physical geography. According to the fragmentary records preserved in the Crystal Tower's archives before its destruction, Aldmeris was characterized by what the ancient texts call the untime, a period when the linear progression of moments that we take for granted had not yet fully established itself. The Aldmer of this era existed in a state that partook of both mortal limitation and divine transcendence, experiencing change and growth while retaining clear memories of their spiritual origins. This unique condition manifested in various ways that would seem miraculous to later generations. The early Aldmer possessed what their records call the sight of seeing, an ability to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously, to understand the consequences of actions before those actions were taken. They could communicate across vast distances through pure thought, reshape their physical forms according to need or desire, and draw energy directly from the flow of magicka that connected all things. Yet for all their extraordinary capabilities, the Aldmer faced a fundamental tension that would eventually drive them from their original home. They had chosen to accept the limitations of material existence, to experience growth through constraint and change through choice. But the very perfection of their condition in Aldmer began to feel like a different kind of limitation, the constraint of perfection itself, the stasis that comes from having no challenges left to overcome. This tension manifested differently among different groups within Aldmeri society. Some, who would eventually become known as the Aldmeri purists, believed that their current state represented the ideal form of existence, a perfect balance between mortal experience and divine awareness that should be preserved unchanged for all eternity. They viewed any suggestion of further change or development as a betrayal of the sacrifices made by the Etada, who had given up their pure spiritual existence to create the possibility of this balanced state. Others, who came to be called the Wandering Folk, felt an inexplicable restlessness, a sense that their current perfection was meant to be not an end point, but a beginning. They experienced what their poets described as the hunger of horizons, an irrepressible desire to explore new possibilities, to test their capabilities against unknown challenges, to discover what forms of existence might emerge from the interaction between their refined consciousness and unfamiliar environments. A third group, the deep thinkers, approached the question from a more philosophical perspective. They argued that true transcendence could only come through the complete integration of all possible experiences, that remaining in Aldmeris, however perfect it might seem, would ultimately limit their development. Only by engaging with the full spectrum of existence, including its difficulties, conflicts, and imperfections, could they achieve the deepest understanding of what it meant to be conscious beings in a material universe. These philosophical differences simmered for what might have been centuries or millennia, Time itself flowed differently in the Dawn era, making precise chronology impossible, but gradually the tension reached a point where peaceful coexistence became difficult to maintain. The very perfection of Aldmeri society, which had once been its greatest strength, began to feel constraining to those who yearned for new experiences and challenges. The catalyst for what would become known as the Great Exodus appears to have been a series of visions received by various Aldmeri seers and mystics. These visions spoke of a land across the waters, a vast continent where the interplay between order and chaos, between the established and the unknown, would create unprecedented opportunities for growth and development. The visions described this land as Tamriel, the dawn's beauty, the place of testing, the arena where consciousness could explore its full potential. What made these visions particularly compelling was their consistency across multiple seers who had no contact with each other, from the northern reaches of Aldmeris to its southern shores, from the mystical enclaves of the deep thinkers to the wandering camps of the horizon seekers. Similar visions appeared with remarkable regularity. They spoke not just of a new land, but of a new form of existence, one where the careful balance maintained in Aldmeris would give way to dynamic tensions that would drive continuous evolution and development. The visions were not without their warnings. The seers spoke of challenges that would test every aspect of Aldmeri wisdom and capability. They foresaw conflicts with other forms of consciousness, transformations that would alter the very nature of those who undertook them, and the possibility that some who departed Aldmeris would become so changed that they would no longer recognize their original selves. But even these warnings seemed to energize rather than deter those who felt called to make the journey. The decision to undertake the Great Exodus was not made lightly or unanimously. Extended councils were held, lasting for periods that might have been years in linear time. The Aldmeri purists argued passionately that leaving Aldmeris would represent a betrayal of their ancestors' sacrifice, an abandonment of the perfect state they had achieved through so much effort and wisdom. They warned that the very changes the wandering folk sought would corrupt and diminish them, that they would lose more than they gained through such radical departure. The deep thinkers, characteristically, approached the question from multiple angles simultaneously. They developed elaborate mathematical models to predict the outcomes of various choices, consulted the most ancient archives for precedents and guidance, and engaged in prolonged meditative practices designed to achieve clarity about the fundamental nature of existence and development. Their eventual conclusion was that while departure carried significant risks, remaining in Aldmeris carried the even greater risk of spiritual stagnation. The wandering folk, for their part, found the debate itself increasingly irrelevant. Their visions of Tamriel had awakened such a profound longing that philosophical arguments seemed secondary to the immediate, intuitive certainty that their destiny lay across the waters. Some began making preparations for departure even before any formal decision had been reached, gathering supplies and knowledge for the journey ahead. When the final decision was made, it came not through majority vote or authoritative decree, but through what the records describe as the sundering of ways, a recognition that the Aldmeri people had reached a point where different groups needed to follow different paths in order to remain true to their deepest nature. Those who felt called to remain in Aldmeris would do so, preserving the ancient ways and maintaining connection to the original Aldmeri understanding. Those who felt called to journey to Tamriel would undertake that voyage, accepting whatever transformations it might bring. The Great Exodus itself was unlike any migration in later history. This was not a desperate flight from danger or a conquest driven by ambition, but rather a spiritual pilgrimage undertaken by beings whose capabilities far exceeded those of any subsequent travelers. The Aldmer did not require ships in the conventional sense, but created vessels that partook of both physical and metaphysical properties, structures that could navigate not only the physical waters between continents, but the conceptual distances between different modes of existence. The journey to Tamriel was described in later accounts as transformative in itself. As the Exodus fleet moved farther from Aldmeris and closer to their destination, the travelers began to experience changes that would have been impossible in their homeland. The linear flow of time asserted itself more strongly, reducing their ability to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously. Their capacity for telepathic communication diminished, forcing them to rely more heavily on spoken language and physical gestures. But these losses were accompanied by gains that many found equally significant. Their connection to physical matter became stronger and more intimate, allowing for new forms of artistic expression and technological innovation. Their individual identities became more distinct and defined, creating possibilities for relationships and forms of collaboration that had been impossible in the more unified consciousness of Aldmeris. Most importantly, they began to experience genuine uncertainty about the future, which paradoxically made their choices feel more meaningful and significant. The first landing on Tamriel's shores is recorded in various traditions as a moment of both triumph and profound disorientation. The Aldmer found themselves in a world that was recognizably material, yet fundamentally different from anything they had experienced. The very air seemed to pulse with potential, with possibilities for change and development that had been absent from the perfected environment of Aldmer. But they also encountered challenges that tested every aspect of their wisdom and capability. The land itself seemed to respond to their presence, not always in welcoming ways. Weather patterns shifted unpredictably, geographical features appeared and disappeared according to principles they did not immediately understand. The flora and fauna of this new continent exhibited forms of consciousness and behavior that defied their previous categories of understanding. Most significantly, they discovered that they were not alone. Tamriel was already inhabited by various forms of consciousness, some recognizably descended from the Itada, like themselves, others apparently emerging from the unique conditions of this continent. These included the ancestors of what would later become the human races, various beast peoples, whose relationship to divine consciousness followed different patterns entirely, and entities that seemed to bridge the gap between the material and spiritual realms in ways that challenged all previous Aldmeri understanding. The initial encounters between the newly arrived Aldmer and these indigenous populations range from curious cooperation to cautious coexistence to outright conflict. The Aldmer possess capabilities that often seemed miraculous to the local inhabitants, but they also found themselves struggling to understand and adapt to conditions that the natives navigated with intuitive ease. This created a complex dynamic of mutual dependence and mutual wariness that would characterize interracial relations in Tamriel for millennia to come. As the Aldmer established their first settlements on Tamrielic soil, they faced fundamental questions about how to structure their society in this new environment. The institutions and practices that had worked perfectly in Aldmer is often proved inadequate or even counterproductive in the more chaotic and unpredictable conditions of Tamriel. They needed to develop new forms of organization, new approaches to magic and technology, new ways of understanding their relationship to the land and to each other. Different groups of Aldmer responded to these challenges in different ways, and it was here that the first seeds of future racial distinctions began to emerge. Some sought to recreate the conditions of Aldmeris as closely as possible, establishing carefully controlled environments where the old ways could be preserved and practiced. Others embraced the chaos and unpredictability of their new home, allowing themselves to be changed by it in ways that would have been unthinkable in their original homeland. Still others sought middle paths, attempting to maintain their essential Aldmeri identity while adapting specific practices and perspectives to meet the demands of their new environment. Each of these approaches would eventually give rise to distinct elven cultures, each representing a different answer to the fundamental question of how beings with divine heritage should live in a material world. The early period of Aldmeri settlement in Tamriel was characterized by what historians call the time of flowering, a period of rapid diversification and experimentation that lasted for several centuries. During this time, the unity that had characterized Aldmeri society began to give way to increasing specialization and differentiation. Groups that had been distinguished primarily by philosophical emphasis began to develop distinct cultural practices, forms of governance, magical traditions, and even physical characteristics. This process of differentiation was accelerated by the geographical dispersal of the Aldmeri population across the vast continent of Tamriel. Unlike the relatively uniform environment of Aldmeri, Tamriel presented a stunning diversity of climates, terrains, and ecological conditions. Groups that settled in the ancient forests developed different relationships to nature than those who established themselves on islands or in mountainous regions. Those who encountered specific indigenous populations learned different lessons about survival and adaptation than those who found themselves in more isolated conditions. The land itself seemed to participate actively in this process of differentiation. Unlike Aldmeris, where the environment had been shaped by conscious intention to support a particular form of existence, Tamriel appeared to have its own agenda, its own ways of shaping those who dwelt upon it. The Aldmer discovered that extended residence in different regions of the continent resulted in gradual but significant changes, not just in cultural practice, but in physical capability, magical affinity, and even fundamental perspective on existence. These changes were welcomed by some as evidence that they had indeed found the dynamic environment their visions had promised, a place where consciousness could explore its full potential through engagement with genuine challenges and uncertainties. Others viewed these transformations with alarm, seeing them as corruption of the pure Aldmeri nature they had worked so hard to achieve and preserve. As the centuries passed, and the differences between various Aldmeri populations became more pronounced, questions arose about the fundamental nature of identity and continuity. Were these various groups still truly Aldmeri, or had they become something new? If they had become something new, was this transformation a fulfillment of their original purpose, or a betrayal of it? These questions would continue to shape elven philosophy and politics for millennia to come. The period of early Aldmeri settlement in Tamriel thus represents both an ending and a beginning, the end of Aldmeri unity and the beginning of elven diversity. It was during this crucial time that the foundations were laid for all the subsequent developments in elven civilization, from the proud isolationism of the Altmer to the revolutionary transformation of the Chimer, from the nature mysticism of the Bosmer to the tragic corruption of the Falmer. As we prepare to explore each of these distinct paths in greater detail, let us carry with us an appreciation for the courage and vision of those original Aldmer who chose to leave the perfection of their homeland in search of something greater, the opportunity to grow, to change, to discover new forms of consciousness and new ways of being in relationship with the world around them. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to those who sought to preserve the ancient ways most faithfully, the Altmer of Somerset Isle, whose quest for perfection and transcendence would shape not only their own destiny, but the political landscape of all Tamriel. Chapter 2. The Altmer and the Preservation of Ancient Ways. Of all the elven peoples who emerged from the great diaspora of the Aldmer, none have maintained as clear a connection to their ancestral origins as the Aldmer, the High Elves of Somerset Isle. In their gleaming cities, their ancient traditions, and their unwavering commitment to what they consider the highest ideals of elven civilization, the Aldmer have sought to preserve and perfect the legacy of Aldmer is across thousands of years of history. The name Altmer itself carries profound meaning in the ancient Aldmeri tongue. It translates not merely as High Elves, but as the cultured people or the first folk proper, reflecting their belief that they alone among the various elven races have remained true to the original vision and values of their ancestors. This is not mere arrogance, though outsiders often interpret it as such, but rather a deeply held conviction that certain truths and ways of being are too precious to be compromised or abandoned, regardless of the pressures of changing times. When the first Aldmer arrived on the shores of Tamriel during the Dawn Era, various groups dispersed across the continent in search of suitable places to establish their new settlements. The ancestors of the Aldmer found themselves drawn to a chain of large islands to the southwest of the mainland, a place that would come to be known as Somerset Isle. What attracted them to this particular location was not merely its physical beauty, though the islands possessed a luminous quality that reminded them of certain aspects of lost Aldmer, but its unique metaphysical properties. The Somerset Archipelago existed in a state of what the early settlers called temporal stability, a condition where the flow of time moved with unusual regularity and predictability compared to other regions of Tamriel. This stability allowed for the preservation of complex magical practices that required extended periods of undisturbed development. It also provided an environment where the long-term planning and gradual refinement that characterize Altmeri culture could flourish without constant disruption from external chaos. The early Aldmeri settlements on Somerset were designed according to principles of sacred geometry that had been preserved from the time of Aldmeris. Every building, every street, every garden was positioned to create harmonious relationships with both the natural energies of the islands and the celestial patterns that governed magical practice. The result was not merely a collection of cities, but a unified architectural symphony that transformed the entire landscape into a single vast work of art. At the heart of this architectural achievement stood crystal-like Law, the great tower that we explored in our previous journey together. For the Altmer, this crystalline spire represented far more than a magical construct or political symbol. It embodied their deepest aspirations toward perfection and transcendence. The tower served as both a practical anchor for reality and a spiritual reminder of what elven civilization could achieve when it remained true to its highest principles. The society that developed around crystal-like Law reflected Altmeri beliefs about the proper ordering of existence. Their culture was structured according to what they called the hierarchy of refinement, a complex system that recognized different levels of achievement in various aspects of life, from magical ability and artistic accomplishment to philosophical understanding and spiritual development. Unlike the rigid caste systems found in some human societies, the Altmer hierarchy was theoretically fluid, allowing individuals to advance through merit and achievement rather than birth or political connection. In practice, however, this meritocracy operated according to standards so demanding and specific that advancement often required not just exceptional ability, but also access to resources and training that were more readily available to those already in privileged positions. The result was a society that combined genuine appreciation for excellence with subtle but persistent inequalities that could perpetuate themselves across generations. The Altmer approach to magic exemplified their broader cultural values, where other elven peoples developed magical traditions that emphasized adaptation, innovation, or harmony with natural forces. The Altmer focused on precision, refinement, and the systematic exploration of magical principles that had been established during the time of Aldmeris. Their magical academies, most notably the Crystal Towers schools, became renowned throughout Tamriel for the depth and sophistication of their theoretical understanding. Aldmeri magical practice was characterized by what their practitioners called the long work, extended projects that might take decades or even centuries to complete, requiring multiple generations of mages to maintain and develop. These projects included the creation of artifacts of extraordinary power and complexity, the development of spells that could reshape entire landscapes, and research into the fundamental nature of reality itself. The destruction of crystal-like lore during the Oblivion Crisis represented not just a political disaster, but the loss of magical knowledge that had been accumulating for thousands of years. The Altmer relationship with time reflected their conviction that true understanding and genuine achievement could not be rushed or forced. Their educational system was designed to unfold gradually across the extended lifespans that characterized elven existence. A typical Altmer might spend the first century of their life in basic studies, the second century exploring various specializations, and subsequent centuries mastering increasingly subtle and complex disciplines. This approach allowed for depth of understanding that shorter-lived races could rarely achieve, but it also tended to create resistance to rapid change or innovation. This temporal perspective shaped Altmer politics and diplomacy in ways that often frustrated their human neighbors. Where human kingdoms might negotiate treaties designed to last for decades, the Altmer thought in terms of arrangements that would remain stable for centuries or millennia. They approached political problems with patience and deliberation that could seem like indecision to those operating on shorter timescales, but which often proved remarkably effective in the long term. The Altmer approach to religion and spirituality was similarly characterized by preservation and refinement of ancient traditions. They maintained elaborate shrines and temples dedicated to the same Iteda their ancestors had revered in Aldmeris, conducting rituals whose forms had been preserved with meticulous care across thousands of years. But their religious practice was not merely conservative. It was also contemplative, seeking ever deeper understanding of divine principles through careful study and meditation. Central to Aldmer spirituality was the concept of the return, the belief that the ultimate goal of existence was to transcend the limitations of mortal existence and achieve reunion with the divine consciousness from which all beings had originally emerged. This was not conceived as an escape from material reality, but as the culmination of a process of refinement and development that required full engagement with the challenges and opportunities of mortal existence. The pursuit of the return influenced every aspect of Altmer culture, from their artistic traditions to their approaches to governance. Art was valued not merely for its aesthetic qualities, but for its capacity to awaken spiritual insight and inspire higher states of consciousness. Literature explored themes of transcendence and enlightenment through complex allegorical narratives that revealed different levels of meaning to readers at different stages of spiritual development. Music was composed according to mathematical principles believed to reflect the harmonic structures underlying reality itself. Aldmeri architecture embodied these same principles, creating spaces designed to elevate consciousness and facilitate meditation. Their buildings incorporated precise proportions and angles that were believed to channel beneficial energies, while their gardens were arranged to create contemplative environments where the natural and artificial merged seamlessly. The overall effect was to transform daily life into a form of spiritual practice, where even mundane activities could serve as opportunities for growth and refinement. This integration of spiritual and material concerns extended to Aldmeri approaches to technology and craftsmanship. They developed techniques for working with metals, crystals, and other materials that went far beyond mere functionality, creating objects that were simultaneously practical tools and works of art. Their weapons and armor were renowned not just for their effectiveness in combat, but for their beauty and the spiritual qualities that master crafters could imbue within them. The Altmeri relationship with other races was complex and often problematic, shaped by their conviction that they represented the highest form of civilized existence, while other peoples remained trapped in various stages of spiritual and cultural development. This perspective was not necessarily malicious. Many Altmer genuinely believed that sharing their knowledge and practices would benefit other races by helping them achieve higher states of consciousness and social organization. However, this benevolent condescension often proved deeply offensive to other peoples who had their own proud traditions and ways of understanding existence. The Altmeri tendency to approach diplomatic and cultural exchange from a position of assumed superiority created tensions that persisted across millennia, contributing to the complex web of interracial conflicts that have shaped Tamrielic history. The relationship between the Altmer and their fellow elven peoples was particularly complicated. The Altmer viewed the other Mer races as their wayward kinfolk who had allowed themselves to be corrupted or diminished through contact with inferior influences. They saw the Dunmer transformation as a tragic fall from grace, the Bosmer adaptation to nature as a surrender to primitive impulses, and the Orsimer corruption as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abandoning proper spiritual principles. This perspective led to periodic attempts by the Altmer to guide or correct their elven cousins, interventions that were rarely welcomed and often actively resisted. The various Altmer dominions throughout history represented institutional expressions of this impulse, attempts to create political structures that would allow Altmer wisdom to shape the development of Tamriel as a whole. The first Aldmeri dominion, established during the Second Era, was founded on the principle that the superior wisdom and magical capability of the Altmer qualified them to serve as benevolent rulers over the other races of Tamriel. This dominion achieved significant territorial expansion and cultural influence, but ultimately collapsed due to internal contradictions and external resistance. The experience taught the Altmer that their ideals of perfection and order were not universally appreciated or desired. The second Aldmeri dominion, which emerged during the Third Era, represented a more pragmatic approach to the same fundamental beliefs. Rather than attempting direct political control, this incarnation focused on cultural and economic influence, seeking to spread Aldmeri values through voluntary adoption rather than conquest. This approach proved more sustainable, but also more limited in its immediate impact. The third and current Aldmeri dominion, which rose to prominence in the Fourth Era under the leadership of the Falmer, represents perhaps the most radical interpretation of traditional Aldmeri beliefs. The Falmer have embraced an apocalyptic vision that sees the current state of reality as fundamentally flawed and seeks to undo the very creation of the mortal plane in order to restore the pure spiritual existence that preceded it. This extremist position has its roots in certain interpretations of ancient Altmeri philosophy, particularly the belief that the creation of Mundus represented a tragic diminishment of divine consciousness rather than an opportunity for growth and development. According to this view, Lorcan's role in creating the mortal plane was not visionary, but destructive, trapping portions of divine consciousness in limited, material forms and preventing their return to their original, unlimited state. The Falmer pursuit of this vision has led them into conflict not only with human empires, but also with other elven peoples who do not share their apocalyptic interpretation of Altmeri tradition. Their actions during the Great War and subsequent political maneuvering have created a complex legacy that continues to shape contemporary Tamrielic politics. Yet it would be a mistake to judge all Altmeri culture by the actions of the Falmer. The majority of Altmeri continue to pursue the traditional path of gradual refinement and spiritual development, seeking transcendence through engagement with rather than escape from the challenges of mortal existence. Their contributions to magical knowledge, artistic achievement, and philosophical understanding remain significant and valuable, regardless of the political controversies surrounding their more extreme representatives. The Altmeri approach to education and scholarship has produced some of the most profound thinkers and most accomplished practitioners of magical arts in Tamrielic history. Their libraries contain texts and treatises that represent thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Their laboratories have yielded discoveries that have benefited all the races of Tamriel, and their artistic traditions continue to inspire and influence creative works throughout the known world. The destruction of crystal-like lore during the Oblivion Crisis represented a catastrophic loss not just for the Altmer, but for all of Tamriel. The tower had served as a repository for magical knowledge and artistic achievement that could never be fully reconstructed. Its fall also disrupted magical and spiritual practices that had been maintained for millennia, forcing the Altmer to adapt their traditions in ways that many found deeply disturbing. This traumatic event may have contributed to the rise of extremist movements like the Falmer, as some Altmer concluded that their traditional approaches to preserving and refining their heritage were insufficient to protect it from the chaos and violence that seemed to characterize the contemporary world. The loss of their most sacred site led some to embrace more radical solutions, even if those solutions threatened to destroy the very things they claimed to protect. Despite these contemporary challenges, the Altmeri tradition continues to offer valuable insights into questions that concern all conscious beings. How do we preserve what is most precious while remaining open to necessary growth and change? How do we maintain high standards and aspirations without becoming rigid or exclusionary? How do we honor our heritage while engaging constructively with those who come from different backgrounds and traditions? The Altmeri experience suggests that these questions have no easy answers, that the pursuit of perfection and transcendence requires constant balance between seemingly contradictory impulses. Their successes demonstrate the value of patience, dedication, and commitment to excellence, while their failures illuminate the dangers of pride, isolation, and the refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of other approaches to existence. As we contemplate the Aldmeri path and its implications, we might reflect on our own relationships to tradition and innovation, to individual achievement and collective responsibility, to the pursuit of excellence and the acceptance of limitation. The Altmer remind us that some values and insights are indeed precious enough to preserve across generations, but they also illustrate the importance of holding those treasures lightly enough to allow for growth and change. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to a very different elven response to the challenges of existence in Tamriel, the Dunmer of Morrowind, whose embrace of conflict and change led them down paths that would have been unimaginable to their Aldmeri ancestors, ultimately resulting in one of the most dramatic transformations in all of elven history. Chapter 3: The Dunmer and the Embrace of Change. In the volcanic lands of Morrowind, beneath the shadow of Red Mountain, dwells a people whose very existence speaks to the transformative power of choice, conflict, and divine intervention. The Dunmer, the Dark Elves, represent perhaps the most dramatic example of how the descendants of the ancient Aldmer could evolve, not through gradual refinement like their Altmeri cousins, but through revolutionary transformation that would reshape their very nature, their appearance, and their understanding of what it means to exist as conscious beings in a challenging world. The story of the Dunmer begins not with the name they bear today, but with their identity as the Chimer, the changed folk, or people of the north. When the great exodus from Aldmeris brought the first elves to Tamriel's shores, some groups were drawn to the harsh and challenging lands of the northeast, where volcanic activity, harsh weather, and difficult terrain created conditions unlike anything their ancestors had experienced in the peaceful perfection of their original homeland. What attracted the ancestors of the Chimer to this forbidding landscape was not its beauty or comfort, but precisely its difficulty. Unlike the Altmer, who sought to recreate the perfection of Altmer is in their new home, or other elven groups who looked for environments that would allow them to develop their inherited capabilities in harmony with natural forces. The proto-Chimer were drawn by an almost mystical conviction that growth and development could only come through struggle, conflict, and the constant testing of one's abilities against genuine challenges. This philosophy was articulated most clearly by the prophet Veloth, whose teachings would profoundly shape Chimeric culture and ultimately lead to their transformation into the Dunmer we know today. Veloth preached what he called the Pishichic endeavor, not the contemplative mysticism practiced by the Pishic order of Artaeum, but a more confrontational approach to spiritual development that embraced conflict as a necessary catalyst for growth. According to Veloth's teachings, the comfortable perfection that the Aldmer had achieved in their original homeland had become a spiritual trap, a state of stagnation that prevented further development. He argued that consciousness could only evolve through engagement with opposition, that wisdom could only emerge from the resolution of contradictions, and that true strength could only be developed through testing against genuine adversity. This philosophy led Veloth and his followers to seek out not just the harsh physical environment of Morrowind, but also spiritual and philosophical challenges that would force them to grow beyond their inherited limitations. They began to question the traditional Aldmeri reverence for the Aedra, the original spirits who had sacrificed themselves to create the mortal plane, and instead turned their attention to the Daedra, those spirits who had refused to participate in creation and maintained their individual consciousness and power. This turn toward Daedric worship was not driven by a desire for easy power or corrupt influence, as their critics often claimed, but by a sophisticated theological understanding that saw the Daedra as representing principles of change, growth, and transcendence that the more static Aedra could not provide. The Chimere developed particular devotion to three Daedric princes who embodied aspects of the spiritual development they sought: Boethia, who represented the struggle against false authority and the courage to forge new paths; Mafala, who embodied the complex web of relationships and hidden knowledge that connected all things; and Azura, who governed the transitions and transformations that marked the boundary between different states of being. Under Velof's guidance, the Chimere developed a culture that celebrated what they called the Siegic endeavor, the ongoing struggle to transcend limitation through engagement with challenge. Their society was organized around the principle of productive conflict, where different groups and individuals were encouraged to test their ideas and abilities against one another in ways that would drive continuous improvement and innovation. This approach extended to every aspect of Chimere life, from their political structures to their approach to magic and technology. Where the Altmer developed magical traditions based on the preservation and refinement of ancient knowledge, the Chimere emphasized experimentation and adaptation, developing new forms of magic that drew on the harsh energies of their volcanic homeland. Their technology incorporated materials and techniques that would have been considered dangerous or unstable by other elven cultures, but which allowed for innovations impossible through more conservative approaches. The Chimere relationship with the divine took a dramatic turn with the emergence of what would become known as the Tribunal, three mortal Chimere who achieved godhood through means that remain controversial even today. Indoril Nerevar, a great war leader and unifier of the Chimera people, worked closely with his counselors Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil to explore the deepest mysteries of existence and transformation. The transformation of these three mortals into the Tribunal gods represents one of the most significant theological and metaphysical events in Tamrielic history. Through their access to the heart of Lorcan, the divine essence we explored in our previous journey through the mysteries of the towers, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil transcended the limitations of mortal existence while remaining engaged with and committed to the welfare of their people. But the price of this transformation was higher than anyone had anticipated. The process that elevated the Tribunal to godhood also resulted in the transformation of the entire Chimera people. In a single night, their golden skin turned the ash-gray color that characterizes the Dunmer today, while their eyes became the burning red that reflects their connection to the volcanic forces of their homeland. This transformation was understood by the Chimera as a blessing from Azura, marking them as a people set apart, chosen to walk a path of constant change and development. The newly transformed Dunmer embraced their altered appearance as a sign of their unique destiny. The ash-gray skin connected them more intimately to the volcanic landscape of Morrowind, while their red eyes were seen as reflecting the fires of transformation that burned within their souls. Rather than mourning the loss of their original Aldmeri appearance, they celebrated their transformation as evidence that they had successfully transcended the limitations of their ancestry. Under the guidance of the Tribunal, Dunmeri civilization flourished in ways that would have been impossible under their original Chimeri traditions. The three god rulers brought different gifts to their people. Vivek, the warrior poet, taught the arts of creative conflict and the transcendence of apparent contradictions. Almalexia, the mother goddess, provided nurturing guidance and protection, while also embodying the fierce love that will destroy threats to what it cherishes. And Sothasil, the clockwork god, explored the intersection of magic and technology, creating marvels that pushed the boundaries of what was possible within the constraints of material existence. The Tribunal period represents the height of Dunmer achievement, when their embrace of change and conflict produced a civilization that was simultaneously stable and dynamic, traditional and innovative. Their cities, built into and around the challenging terrain of Morrowind, became marvels of architecture and engineering that worked with, rather than against, the volcanic forces of their environment. Their magical traditions developed unique approaches to manipulating the energies of their homeland, including the famous techniques for binding and commanding Daedric entities. But the Tribunal era also contained within it the seeds of its own transformation. The reliance on divine guidance, however wise and benevolent, gradually began to conflict with the original chimeric principle of growth through independent struggle. Some Dunmer began to question whether the comfort and security provided by their god rulers was leading them toward the same kind of spiritual stagnation that Veloth had identified in the original Aldmeris civilization. These tensions came to a head with the return of the Nerevarine, the prophesied reincarnation of Induril Nerevarine. The Neravarine's arrival marked the beginning of the end for the Tribunal's direct rule over the Dunmer people, as ancient prophecies were fulfilled and long-hidden truths about the nature of divine power were revealed. The fall of the Tribunal forced the Dunmer to confront fundamental questions about the nature of authority, tradition, and change. Without their god rulers to provide guidance and protection, they were compelled to rediscover the principles of self-reliance and adaptive struggle that had originally driven their ancestors to seek out the challenges of Morrowind. This transition was made even more difficult by the catastrophic eruption of Red Mountain and the subsequent invasion by Argonian forces, events that tested Dunmer resilience and adaptability in ways that rivaled anything their ancestors had faced. The contemporary Dunmer response to these challenges has demonstrated the enduring relevance of their cultural commitment to growth through adversity, rather than attempting to restore the past or seeking refuge in other lands. Many Dunmer communities have embraced these difficulties as opportunities for renewed development and transformation. They have adapted their traditions to meet new circumstances while maintaining their essential identity as a people committed to embracing rather than avoiding the challenges of existence. The Dunmer approach to ancestor worship exemplifies this balance between continuity and change. Unlike cultures that venerate ancestors as static examples to be imitated, the Dunmer understand their deceased family members as continuing participants in an ongoing process of development and transformation. Ancestor spirits are consulted not just for wisdom about traditional practices, but for guidance in adapting to new circumstances and challenges that previous generations never faced. This dynamic understanding of ancestry reflects broader Dunmer attitudes toward tradition and innovation. They preserve ancient knowledge and practices not as museum pieces, but as living resources that can be adapted and developed to meet contemporary needs. Their magical traditions continue to evolve, incorporating new techniques and insights while maintaining connection to the fundamental principles that have guided Dunmer development for millennia. The Dunmer relationship with other races has been shaped by their understanding that conflict and competition can serve constructive purposes when approached with the right attitude and intentions. Unlike the Aldmer tendency toward condescension or the isolationist impulses of some other elven peoples, the Dunmer have generally been willing to engage with other cultures on terms that acknowledge both difference and potential for mutual benefit. This openness to engagement has not always made them popular with their neighbors, as Dunmer directness and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths can be unsettling to those who prefer more diplomatic approaches to intercultural relations, but it has also allowed them to develop relationships based on genuine understanding rather than polite surface agreements, creating foundations for cooperation that can withstand significant stress and challenge. The great houses that organize much of Dunmer society reflect their cultural commitment to productive conflict and adaptive change. Each house represents not just a political or economic faction, but a different approach to the fundamental questions of how to live and thrive in a challenging world. House Redoran emphasizes martial honor and the development of strength through discipline and testing. House Hollow focuses on adaptation and innovation, particularly in economic and diplomatic contexts. House Telvanni pursues individual excellence and the transcendence of conventional limitations through magical research and experimentation. These different approaches create ongoing tensions and competitions within Dunmer society, but these conflicts are generally understood as constructive rather than destructive. The interplay between different house philosophies and practices drives continuous innovation and adaptation, preventing any single approach from becoming too dominant or rigid. This system embodies the Dunmer conviction that diversity and opposition serve essential functions in maintaining the health and vitality of their civilization. The Dunmer magical traditions reflect their broader cultural values, emphasizing personal development and the creative resolution of apparently contradictory forces, where Aldmer magic tends toward the preservation and refinement of established principles. Dunmer magical practice encourages experimentation and the integration of opposing elements. Their mages are taught to work with forces that other traditions might consider dangerous or unstable, developing the skill and confidence needed to transform potential chaos into useful power. This approach has led to innovations in magical practice that have influenced traditions throughout Tamriel. Dunmer techniques for binding and commanding Daedric entities, their methods for working with the unstable energies of volcanic systems, and their approaches to integrating individual will with transpersonal forces have all contributed to the broader development of magical knowledge and practice. The architectural achievements of the Dunmer similarly reflect their commitment to working with rather than against challenging conditions. Their cities and settlements are designed to take advantage of volcanic activity, geothermal energy, and the unique materials available in their harsh environment. Rather than importing styles and techniques from more comfortable regions, they have developed distinctly Dunmer approaches to building that create beauty and functionality from the specific conditions of their homeland. Perhaps most significantly, the Dunmer have maintained their commitment to the principle that consciousness develops through engagement with challenge rather than retreat into comfort or security. This conviction has allowed them to adapt and thrive in circumstances that might have broken cultures with different underlying assumptions about the nature of growth and development. As we contemplate the Dunmer path and its implications, we might reflect on our own relationships to challenge and change, to tradition and innovation, to individual development and collective responsibility. The Dunmer experience suggests that some of our greatest opportunities for growth may come precisely from those situations that seem most difficult or threatening, that the courage to engage with, rather than avoid life's challenges, can lead to forms of strength and wisdom that would be impossible to achieve through easier paths. Their story also illustrates the importance of maintaining flexibility and adaptability even within strong traditions, of being willing to question and revise even cherished beliefs when circumstances require it. The Dunmer remind us that true strength comes not from rigid adherence to established patterns, but from the ability to respond creatively and constructively to whatever challenges life presents. In our next chapter, we will explore yet another approach to the fundamental questions of elven existence, turning our attention to the Bosmer of Valenwood, whose integration with the natural world represents a form of wisdom that transcends the apparent opposition between civilization and wildness, between individual consciousness and collective harmony. Chapter 4: The Bosmer and the Wisdom of the Wild. In the ancient forests of Valenwood, where the canopy grows so thick that sunlight barely touches the forest floor, where the trees themselves are said to whisper secrets older than written history, dwells a people who have discovered a form of wisdom that transcends the apparent opposition between civilization and wildness, between individual consciousness and the vast patterns of the natural world. The Bosmer, the Wood Elves, represent yet another path taken by the descendants of the ancient Aldmer, one that leads not toward the preservation of ancestral perfection or the embrace of transformative conflict, but toward a profound integration with the living systems of their forest homeland. The story of the Bosmer begins, like all elven tales, with the great exodus from Aldmeris and the dispersal of the Aldmer across the continent of Tamriel, but where their cousins were drawn to islands of temporal stability or volcanic lands of challenging adversity, the ancestors of the Bosmer found themselves called to the vast forests of Valenwood, a realm where the boundary between the cultivated and the wild had never been clearly established, where the very concept of civilization took on meanings unknown in other parts of the world. What distinguished the Proto-Bosmer from other elven groups was not any particular magical ability or philosophical doctrine, but rather an unusual sensitivity to what they came to call the Green Song, the complex web of relationships, communications, and mutual dependencies that connected every living thing within the forest ecosystem. Where other elves perceived trees as resources to be managed or obstacles to be cleared, the ancestors of the Bosmer heard voices, felt emotions, sensed intentions and desires that spoke of consciousness distributed throughout the forest rather than concentrated in individual beings. This sensitivity led them to a profound realization that would reshape their entire understanding of existence. They were not visitors to the forest, but participants in it, not masters of nature, but expressions of it, not separate beings who happened to live among trees, but aspects of a single, vast, living system that encompassed everything from the smallest insect to the mightiest gradoak. This recognition marked the beginning of their transformation from conventional elves into something unprecedented in the history of Tamriel. The pivotal moment in Bosmer history came with their encounter with Yufrei, the forest god, whose nature defied the conventional categories that other cultures used to understand divine beings. Yufrei was neither Adra nor Daedra in the usual sense, but something altogether different, a consciousness that embodied the principle of natural harmony itself, the intelligence that guided the evolution and interaction of all living systems. Yufrei represented not the imposition of order upon chaos, as the Aedra were understood to do, nor the preservation of individual consciousness against dissolution, as the Daedra exemplified, but rather the wisdom that emerged from the dynamic balance of countless interconnected lives. The agreement that the Proto-Bosmer reached with Yufrei became known as the Green Pact, though this name barely captures the profound nature of the relationship it established. This was not a contract in any conventional sense, not a bargain struck between separate parties for mutual benefit, but rather a recognition of fundamental interconnection, an acknowledgement that the elves and the forest were not two things relating to each other, but aspects of a single reality, expressing itself through apparent multiplicity. Under the terms of the Green Pact, the Bosmer agreed to certain restrictions that would have seemed impossible to other elven cultures. They would not harm the forest plant life of Valenwood, would not cut down trees or gather wood for construction, would not clear land for agriculture or build cities in the conventional sense. In exchange, Euphrey promised that the forest itself would provide for all their needs, that the trees would offer shelter, that the plants would yield nourishment, that the very landscape would reshape itself to accommodate their presence. But the Green Pact involved more than mere restrictions and promises. It also included a transformation of the Bosmer themselves, a fundamental alteration of their nature that would allow them to participate more fully in the life of the forest. Euphrey stabilized their physical forms, for in the early days of their settlement in Valenwood, the Bosmer had been shapeshifters, able to take on different forms according to need or desire, a capability that had proven more chaotic than beneficial in their efforts to build lasting communities. This stabilization came with what Euphrey called the gift of the fixed form, but it was a complex gift that embodied both limitation and liberation. While the Bosmer could no longer change their basic physical structure at will, they gained something perhaps more valuable, a stable identity around which to build relationships, traditions, and the accumulated wisdom that comes from consistent experience over time. They became fully themselves in a way that had not been possible when their very nature remained fluid and uncertain. Yet Euphrey's gift retained elements of the shape-shifting heritage, manifesting in the Bosmer's remarkable ability to move through the forest in ways that seemed to transcend normal physical limitations. They could climb trees as easily as walking on level ground, could move through dense undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf, could remain motionless for hours in perfect harmony with their surroundings. These abilities were not magical in the conventional sense, but rather expressions of their deep integration with the forest ecosystem. The Green Pact also established the foundation for what would become the most distinctive and controversial aspect of Bosmer culture, the practice of ritual cannibalism, known as the Meat Mandate. According to the terms of their agreement with Euphrey, the Bosmer were required to consume the flesh of any enemies they killed in combat, a practice that horrified other cultures, but which the Bosmer understood as a sacred responsibility rather than a barbaric custom. This practice reflected their understanding that consciousness was not destroyed by death, but rather transformed and recycled through the great cycles of forest life. By consuming the flesh of those they had been forced to kill, the Bosmer ensured that the consciousness of their enemies would become part of the forest community rather than being lost or returning to haunt the living. It was an act of profound respect and integration, though one that required considerable courage and spiritual discipline to perform properly. The architectural achievements of the Bosmer reflected their unique relationship with their forest environment. Rather than building structures from cut stone or harvested timber, they developed techniques for shaping living trees into functional forms. Their cities were not constructed but grown, with buildings that were literally alive, that continued to change and develop over time, that responded to the needs of their inhabitants in ways that conventional architecture could never match. The walking city of Falinesti represented the pinnacle of this bio-architectural approach. This massive settlement, built around and within a great oak of extraordinary size and age, could move through the forests of Valenwood, according to seasonal patterns that followed routes established over thousands of years. The city's migration allowed its inhabitants to participate in the natural cycles of the forest, while maintaining the benefits of urban civilization, creating a form of settlement that was simultaneously sophisticated and completely integrated with natural processes. The Bosmer approach to magic reflected their understanding of consciousness as distributed throughout the natural world rather than concentrated in individual beings, where other elven cultures developed magical traditions based on the manipulation of external forces through individual will. Bosmer magic emphasized cooperation and communication with the various forms of consciousness that inhabited their forest home. Their mages learned to work with plant spirits, animal consciousnesses, and the overarching intelligence of forest ecosystems themselves. This collaborative approach to magic produced results that often seemed miraculous to outsiders, but which the Bosmer understood as natural expressions of their integration with forest consciousness. They could call upon the aid of animals, could communicate with trees, could navigate through the forest with guidance from the landscape itself. Their healing practices incorporated not just herbs and traditional remedies, but also the cooperation of forest spirits and the direct intervention of plant consciousness in the healing process. The Bosmer understanding of time differed significantly from that of other elven cultures, reflecting their participation in natural cycles rather than linear progression toward distant goals, where the Altmer thought in terms of centuries-long projects aimed at eventual perfection, and the Dunmer embraced constant change and transformation. The Bosmer developed a cyclical understanding of time that emphasized the recurring patterns of growth, maturity, decay, and renewal that characterized all natural processes. This cyclical perspective influenced every aspect of Bosmer culture, from their approaches to governance and law to their understanding of individual development and community responsibility. Rather than seeking to accumulate power or knowledge over time, they focused on maintaining balance and harmony within ongoing cycles, understanding that true wisdom lay not in transcending natural processes, but in aligning oneself with them in increasingly sophisticated ways. The political organization of Bosmer society reflected their integration with forest consciousness through a system that has no parallel in other cultures. Leadership was not based on individual authority or institutional hierarchy, but on the ability to perceive and interpret the will of the forest itself. Decisions were made through collective processes that involved not just the Bosmer inhabitants of a region, but also the trees, animals, and other forms of consciousness that shared the landscape. This approach to governance required extraordinary sensitivity and spiritual discipline, as it demanded that individual desires and opinions be constantly balanced against the needs and perspectives of the larger forest community. Leaders were expected to serve not just their own people, but the entire ecosystem, making decisions that would benefit all forms of consciousness, rather than privileging the interests of any single species or group. The Bosmer relationship with other races was shaped by their understanding that all consciousness, regardless of its specific form, participated in the same fundamental patterns of existence. They were generally more welcoming to outsiders than other elven cultures, but they also expected visitors to respect the principles of the Green Pact and to participate in forest consciousness, rather than simply exploiting forest resources for external purposes. This expectation often led to misunderstandings and conflicts, as other cultures found it difficult to grasp the Bosmer understanding of reciprocal relationship with the natural world. Traders and diplomats who approached Valenwood with conventional assumptions about property, resource extraction, and cultural exchange often found themselves confused by Bosmer responses that seemed to prioritize the welfare of trees and animals over immediate economic or political concerns. The Bosmer approach to warfare reflected their integration with forest consciousness through the practice of the wild hunt, perhaps the most feared military tactic in all of Tamrielic history. When faced with threats that could not be resolved through conventional means, Bosmer communities could invoke ancient agreements with Yufre that temporarily released them from the constraints of fixed form, allowing them to become a horde of shape-shifting predators whose appearance and capabilities defied all conventional understanding of combat. The Wild Hunt was not warfare in any conventional sense, but rather the temporary transformation of an entire community into an expression of the forest's own protective instincts. Those who participated in the hunt lost their individual identities and became aspects of a collective consciousness driven by a single purpose: the elimination of threats to the forest community. The hunt continued until its purpose was achieved, after which the participants gradually returned to their normal forms, often with little memory of what had transpired during their transformation. This practice terrified other cultures not just because of its effectiveness, but because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, consciousness, and the relationship between civilization and wildness. The Wild Hunt demonstrated that the Bosmer had not simply learned to live in harmony with nature, but had become something that transcended the conventional distinction between the civilized and the natural. The contemporary challenges facing Bosmer culture include the ongoing pressures of integration with the wider Tamrielic world, particularly through their participation in various political alliances and their exposure to cultural influences that do not share their understanding of forest consciousness. The Aldmeri dominions' attempts to incorporate Valenwood into broader political structures have created tensions between traditional Bosmer values and the demands of imperial organization. Additionally, changes in the forest itself, whether through natural evolution, magical influence, or the consequences of tower deactivations that we explored in our previous journey, have required ongoing adaptation of traditional practices and understandings. The Bosmer have demonstrated remarkable flexibility in responding to these challenges while maintaining their essential commitment to forest consciousness. But the process has not been without difficulty or controversy. The Bosmer approach to individual development emphasized integration with larger patterns rather than the accumulation of personal power or achievement. Young Bosmer were taught not to master the forest, but to find their unique place within forest consciousness, to discover how their individual gifts and inclinations could best serve the welfare of the larger community. This approach produced individuals who were simultaneously highly capable and deeply humble, possessing sophisticated skills and knowledge, while remaining grounded in their understanding of themselves as expressions of something greater. Perhaps the most profound contribution of Bosmer culture to the broader understanding of consciousness and existence lies in their demonstration that the apparent opposition between individual identity and collective consciousness is not absolute. Through their integration with forest consciousness, they have shown that it is possible to maintain personal identity and agency while participating fully in transpersonal patterns of awareness and decision-making. This integration offers insights that extend far beyond the specific context of forest life, suggesting possibilities for human communities and individual development that transcend the usual assumptions about the relationship between self and world, between personal fulfillment and collective responsibility. The Bosmer experience indicates that some of the most profound forms of wisdom may emerge not from the assertion of individual will against external constraints, but from the discovery of how individual consciousness can participate most fully in the larger patterns of existence. As we contemplate the Bosmer path and its implications, we might reflect on our own relationships to the natural world, to community consciousness, and to the balance between individual expression and collective harmony. Their story suggests that some of our deepest insights about the nature of existence may come not from transcending our embeddedness in natural and social systems, but from learning to participate in those systems with ever greater awareness, sensitivity, and skill. In our next chapter, we will turn to a far more tragic tale, the story of the Falmer, whose encounter with human expansion in Skyrim led not to integration or adaptation, but to corruption and transformation of the most heartbreaking kind, offering sobering lessons about the consequences of fear, desperation, and the choices made in extremity. Chapter 5: The Falmer and the Price of Desperation. In the deepest caverns beneath Skyrim, in darkness so complete that even the memory of sunlight has been lost, dwell beings whose very existence serves as one of the most tragic cautionary tales in all of Tamrielic history. The Falmer, the betrayed, the Snow Elves, the fallen ones, represent not triumph or wisdom, but the terrible consequences of desperation, fear, and the choices made when all other options seem to have vanished. Their story speaks to the fragility of civilization, the corrupting power of dependence, and the irreversible nature of certain transformations. To understand the tragedy of the Falmer, we must first appreciate what they once were. Among all the branches of the Aldmeri diaspora, perhaps none had developed a culture more beautiful, more harmonious, or more perfectly adapted to their chosen environment than the Snow Elves of ancient Skyrim. These were the Falmer of the Dawn era and early Merithic era, not the twisted creatures that bear that name today, but proud and noble elves, whose civilization rivaled anything created by their cousins in other lands. The Snow Elves had been drawn to the northern reaches of Tamriel by visions similar to those that guided other Aldmeri groups to their new homes, but their visions spoke specifically of a land of eternal winter, where the clarity of ice and snow would provide perfect conditions for contemplation and spiritual development. They found in Skyrim not just a challenging environment that would test their capabilities, but a landscape whose stark beauty and demanding climate created unique opportunities for forms of consciousness and cultural development impossible in more temperate regions. The civilization they built in Skyrim was magnificent in its crystalline perfection. Their cities were carved from ice and stone in ways that created structures of breathtaking beauty, buildings that seemed to capture and reflect light in patterns that changed with the seasons and the movement of the sun and moons. Their artisans developed techniques for working with ice, snow, and the unique minerals found in Skyrim's mountains that allowed them to create artifacts of extraordinary delicacy and power. But perhaps most remarkably, the Snow Elves developed what their records call the Winter Way, a form of spirituality that found in the harsh conditions of their homeland not obstacles to overcome, but teachers whose lessons could guide them toward profound insights about the nature of existence. They learned to perceive beauty in desolation, strength in endurance, and wisdom in the acceptance of limitation. Their culture celebrated not comfort or abundance, but clarity of vision and purity of purpose. The Snow Elves' relationship with their environment was one of respectful cooperation rather than domination. They learned to work with the natural cycles of winter and brief summer, to find sustenance in conditions that would have defeated less adapted peoples, and to discover in the apparent emptiness of their landscape a fullness that nourished both body and spirit. Their magic drew on the energies of ice and snow. Their architecture incorporated the natural formations of their mountainous terrain, and their social structures reflected the interdependence necessary for survival in challenging conditions. For thousands of years, Snow Elf civilization flourished in relative isolation, developing its unique characteristics without significant interference from the other peoples of Tamriel. They maintained contact with their elven cousins, but were largely content to pursue their own path of development, finding in their chosen environment all the challenges and opportunities they needed for continued growth and refinement. This peaceful isolation came to an end with the arrival of the Etmorans, the human ancestors of the modern Nords, during the late Malefic era. The initial encounters between Snow Elves and the incoming humans were not immediately hostile. The Etmorans were themselves refugees, fleeing the civil war that had consumed their original homeland, and many among them sought only to find peaceful places to establish new settlements and rebuild their shattered communities. For a time, coexistence seemed possible. Some Snow Elf communities welcomed the human refugees, offering guidance about survival in Skyrim's harsh climate, in exchange for knowledge of technologies and perspectives that the humans brought from their different cultural background. There were even instances of genuine cooperation and friendship between individuals from the two peoples, relationships that suggested the possibility of eventual integration or at least peaceful coexistence. But the fundamental differences between Snow Elf and Atmoran approaches to existence gradually created tensions that proved impossible to resolve. The humans, with their shorter lifespans and more aggressive approach to environmental challenges, sought to transform the landscape to better meet their needs rather than adapting themselves to existing conditions. They cleared forests for agriculture, mined mountains for metals, and built settlements that imposed human patterns on the natural landscape rather than working with existing formations. More troubling from the Snow Elf perspective was the Atmoran approach to expansion and territory, where the Snow Elves had developed sustainable relationships with their environment that could continue indefinitely without depleting resources or fundamentally altering landscapes. The humans pursued what seemed to be unlimited growth, establishing new settlements at a pace that suggested eventual claim to all of Skyrim's habitable lands. These practical concerns were compounded by deeper philosophical and spiritual differences. The Atmorans brought with them religious traditions that emphasize conquest and domination, venerating gods of war and storm, whose favor was won through aggression and expansion rather than contemplation and harmony. Their cultural heroes were warriors and conquerors rather than sages and artists, and their approach to problem-solving favored direct action over patient deliberation. As human populations in Skyrim grew and expanded, individual conflicts began to escalate into broader tensions. Disputes over territory, resources, and cultural practices created a cycle of mistrust and retaliation that gradually eroded the possibilities for peaceful coexistence. Each side began to view the other as an existential threat rather than a potential partner, setting the stage for the tragedy that would follow. The transformation of these tensions into open warfare was precipitated by events whose exact nature remains disputed by historians. Some accounts suggest that it was human aggression and territorial expansion that forced the Snow Elves into defensive action. Others claim that Snow Elf religious extremists launched unprovoked attacks against human settlements. Most likely, the truth involves provocations and escalations on both sides, a spiral of conflict in which each act of violence created justification for greater violence in response. What is certain is that the war, when it came, was devastating for both peoples, but ultimately catastrophic for the Snow Elves. Despite their superior magic and their intimate knowledge of Skyrim's terrain, they found themselves increasingly overwhelmed by human numbers and the relentless aggression of Altmeran military culture. The humans proved more adaptable and more willing to accept heavy casualties in pursuit of victory, while the Snow Elves, with their longer lifespans and smaller population, could not sustain the losses that extended warfare demanded. The turning point came with the legendary figure of Egia's Gramor and his 500 companions, Altmeran warriors, whose military prowess and tactical innovation overwhelmed Snow Elf defenses and began the systematic conquest of elven territories. The details of these campaigns have been preserved primarily in human sources, which celebrate them as heroic achievements, but from the Snow Elf perspective, they represented nothing less than genocide, the deliberate destruction of their people and culture. As their military position became increasingly hopeless, the remaining Snow Elf communities faced an agonizing choice. They could continue to fight until they were completely exterminated, or they could seek some form of accommodation that might allow at least some of their people to survive. It was in this context of desperation that they made the fateful decision that would transform them from proud Snow Elves into the degraded creatures now known as Falmer. The Dunmer of Skyrim, the isolated and enigmatic Deep Elves, who had been pursuing their own mysterious agenda in the underground cities they had carved beneath the mountains, offered the Snow Elves sanctuary in exchange for their submission and service to the desperate elven refugees. This offer seemed like salvation, an opportunity to preserve their lives and perhaps eventually rebuild their culture in safety. But the Dwemer's offer was not made from altruism or even simple political calculation. The Deep Elves had their own agenda, their own experiments and projects that required subjects and workers. They viewed the Snow Elves not as potential allies or even temporary guests, but as raw material for their investigations into the nature of consciousness, transformation, and the malleable boundaries of identity itself. The price of Dwemer protection was not just submission, but fundamental transformation. The Dwemer demanded that the Snow Elves consume fungi that would, they claimed, help them adapt to underground life. These substances did indeed change the refugees, but not in the ways they had been led to expect. Rather than facilitating adaptation, the fungi began a process of systematic degradation that would continue across generations. The first effects were the loss of sight, as the Snow Elves' eyes adapted to the perpetual darkness of the Dwemer cities by becoming increasingly sensitive until bright light became painful and eventually impossible to tolerate. This blindness was presented as a blessing, allowing them to navigate more effectively in their new environment, but it also made them completely dependent on their Dwemer hosts for guidance and protection. But the fungi did more than affect vision. They began to alter the fundamental structure of Snow Elf consciousness and physiology in ways that became increasingly apparent across subsequent generations. Intelligence diminished, replaced by instinctive cunning. Cultural memory faded, leaving only fragmentary traces of their former civilization. Physical capabilities changed, with increased strength and resilience coming at the cost of coordination and fine motor control. Most tragically, the social bonds and cooperative instincts that had characterized Snow Elf culture gave way to aggression and territoriality. The descendants of the refugees became increasingly isolated from one another, suspicious and hostile even toward their own kind. The Dwemer had not simply provided sanctuary, they had systematically destroyed everything that had made the Snow Elves who they were, replacing it with characteristics that served Dwemer purposes rather than Snow Elf welfare. This transformation was not completed in a single generation, but unfolded across centuries, each cohort of Snow Elf descendants becoming more degraded than the last. The process was gradual enough that each generation could adapt to the changes they witnessed in their children, preventing the kind of dramatic realization that might have led to rebellion or escape. By the time the full extent of what was happening became apparent, it was too late to reverse the process. When the Dwemer vanished during the events at Red Mountain, their transformation of the Snow Elves was left incomplete but irreversible. The beings who remained in the abandoned Dwemer cities were no longer Snow Elves in any meaningful sense, but neither were they the obedient servants the Dwemer had intended to create. They were something new and terrible. The Falmer, creatures of darkness and violence, who retained only the most fragmentary memories of their noble heritage. The centuries that followed the Dwemer disappearance saw the Falmer spread throughout the underground systems of Skyrim, establishing territories and developing crude societies based on the degraded remnants of their original culture. They retained certain capabilities, a form of primitive magic, rudimentary tool-making skills, and the ability to domesticate some underground creatures, but these were pale shadows of the sophisticated civilization their ancestors had achieved. The contemporary Falmer represent the end result of this tragic transformation. They are creatures of darkness and instinct, driven by territoriality and aggression, capable of individual cunning, but incapable of the cooperation and cultural development that characterized their ancestors. They pose a constant threat to anyone who ventures into Skyrim's underground spaces, not because they are inherently evil, but because they have been systematically stripped of everything that once made them capable of peaceful coexistence. Yet traces of their former nature occasionally surface in ways that make their condition even more tragic. Some Falmer demonstrate unexpected moments of artistic capability, creating crude but beautiful sculptures or arrangements that hint at aesthetic sensibilities inherited from their Snow Elf heritage. Others show brief flashes of cooperation or even protectiveness toward weaker members of their groups, suggesting that some vestige of their ancestors' social instincts survives beneath the degradation. Perhaps most heartbreaking are the rare instances of Falmer who retain enough self-awareness to recognize something of what they have lost. These individuals, encountered occasionally by explorers brave enough to venture into Falmer territory, display a kind of mourning that suggests they understand, however dimly, that they are the descendants of something far greater than what they have become. The story of the Falmer serves as a warning about the consequences of desperation and the dangers of accepting help from those whose motivations remain hidden. It illustrates how quickly civilization can be destroyed when its foundational values are abandoned in favor of mere survival, and how transformation imposed from outside can be far more destructive than transformation chosen from within. But the Falmer tragedy also raises profound questions about the nature of identity and the reversibility of change. Are the contemporary Falmer still, in some sense, Snow Elves? Is there any possibility of restoration or recovery, or has their transformation passed beyond any point of return? These questions have no easy answers, but they force us to consider what we value most about consciousness and culture, and what we would be willing to sacrifice to preserve them. The legend of the Snow Prince, the last great hero of the original Snow Elves, embodies both the nobility of what was lost and the finality of its destruction. According to Nordic traditions, the Snow Prince fell at the Battle of the Mosring, killed by a child warrior whose own youth emphasized the generational scope of the conflict that had consumed both peoples. His death marked not just the end of organized Snow Elf resistance, but the symbolic completion of their transformation from a proud civilization into something entirely different. Some scholars suggest that the Snow Prince's death was not just a military defeat, but a spiritual transformation, that his sacrifice somehow preserved essential aspects of Snow Elf heritage in forms that transcend the physical degradation of his people. According to this interpretation, the true legacy of the Snow Elves survives not in the Falmer, who bear their genetic heritage, but in the influence they continue to exert on the spiritual and cultural development of Skyrim itself. Others argue that such interpretations represent wishful thinking, attempts to find meaning and consolation in what is simply a story of irreversible loss. From this perspective, the Falmer represent a complete discontinuity with their Snow Elf heritage, a transformation so fundamental that it constitutes the death of one people and the birth of another entirely. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes, in recognition that transformation and loss can be simultaneously complete and incomplete, that something can be irreversibly changed while still retaining traces of its original nature. The Falmer may no longer be Snow Elves, but they carry within themselves the genetic and perhaps spiritual heritage of their ancestors, a heritage that might someday find new forms of expression under different circumstances. As we contemplate the tragedy of the Falmer and its implications, we might reflect on our own relationships to tradition and change, to the choices we make when faced with difficult circumstances, and to the question of what we consider essential to our identity and what we would be willing to sacrifice to preserve it. Their story reminds us that some losses cannot be recovered, that some choices cannot be undone, and that the consequences of our decisions may extend far beyond our own lives to affect generations yet unborn. In our next and final chapter of this exploration of elven diversity, we will turn to perhaps the most controversial of all elven transformations, the creation of the Orsimer, whose very existence challenges conventional understanding of the boundaries between different peoples and the nature of divine intervention in mortal affairs. Chapter 6: The Orsimer and the Power of Divine Transformation. In the mountains and strongholds scattered across Tamriel, in communities that value strength and honor above comfort and convention, dwell a people whose very existence challenges our understanding of identity, transformation, and the power of divine intervention to reshape not just individuals, but entire civilizations. The Orsimer, the orcs, the pariah folk, the transformed ones, represent perhaps the most dramatic example of how divine action can fundamentally alter the nature of an entire people, creating something unprecedented from the transformation of what came before. The story of the Orsimer begins not with their current form, but with their origins as followers of Tribunal, one of the greatest and most honored of the Aldmeri gods. Tribunal was no ordinary deity, but the champion of Auriel, the chief god of the Aldmeri pantheon, a divine warrior whose strength and nobility made him one of the most revered figures in ancient elven religion. He represented the highest ideals of elven civilization: honor, strength, protection of the innocent, and unwavering commitment to righteousness. Tribunal's followers among the early Altmer were known for their exceptional devotion and their embodiment of the martial virtues their god represented. They were the elite warriors and guardians of Aldmeri society, the protectors who stood between their people and the chaos that threatened to destroy the ordered beauty of their civilization. These elves developed a culture that emphasized physical prowess, moral courage, and absolute loyalty to their principles, creating communities that served as bastions of strength and stability in an uncertain world. The transformation that would create the Orsimer from these noble warriors came about through the intervention of Boethia, one of the Daedric princes most associated with the revolution, the overthrow of false authority, and the violent transformation of existing orders. According to the accounts preserved in Dunmer religious texts, Boethia became convinced that Trinimac's influence was preventing the Aldmer from achieving their full potential, keeping them trapped in static patterns of thought and behavior that limited their growth and development. The confrontation between Boethia and Trinimac was not a conventional battle, but something far more fundamental. A contest between different visions of what existence should be, between the stability and order that Trinimac represented, and the dynamic change and transformation that Boethia embodied. The details of this cosmic conflict remain mysterious, described in religious texts through metaphors and symbols that hint at realities beyond normal comprehension. What is clear is that Boethia's victory was complete and transformative. According to Dunmer tradition, Boethia did not simply defeat Trinimac, but devoured him, literally consuming the god's essence and speaking with his voice to confuse and mislead his followers. This act of divine cannibalism was not mere destruction, but a form of transformation so profound that it created something entirely new from what had existed before. The remains of Trinimac, expelled from Boethia after this cosmic digestion, became Malakath, not the noble champion of order and righteousness that Trinimac had been, but a bitter, angry deity associated with outcasts, pariahs, and those who exist on the margins of civilized society. This transformation was not just a change of name or appearance, but a fundamental alteration of divine nature, creating a god whose very essence embodied exile, resentment, and the strength that comes from surviving in hostile circumstances. The followers of Trinimac underwent a parallel transformation, changed not just in their religious allegiances, but in their very physical and cultural nature. Where they had once been golden-skinned elves, indistinguishable from their Aldmeri cousins, they became the green-skinned, tusked beings we know as orcs. This transformation was not gradual, but sudden and complete, affecting entire communities simultaneously in a display of divine power that left no doubt about its supernatural origin. But the physical changes were only the most visible aspect of a transformation that touched every element of orcish existence. Their culture shifted from the refined aesthetics and contemplative practices that characterized Aldmeri civilization to a harsh pragmatism focused on survival, strength, and the protection of community against hostile forces. Their social structures evolved to emphasize martial prowess and the ability to endure hardship rather than the artistic achievement and philosophical sophistication valued by other elven peoples. The newly transformed Orsimer found themselves outcasts, not just from their former communities, but from the broader network of civilized societies that dominated Tamriel. Their changed appearance marked them as different, other, potentially dangerous, while their association with Malakath linked them to a deity that other cultures viewed as corrupt and evil. This rejection forced them to develop new ways of living that could function in isolation from the support systems that sustained other civilizations. The response of the Orsimer to their transformed condition and social rejection reveals much about their essential character. Rather than seeking to restore their former status or attempting to integrate with other elven cultures, they embraced their new identity and the challenges it presented. They developed a fierce pride in their strength and resilience, creating a culture that valued the ability to thrive in difficult circumstances over the comfort and security that other peoples took for granted. Orcish society organized itself around the stronghold system, fortified communities designed to be self-sufficient and defensible against external threats. These strongholds were not merely military installations, but complete social units that included everything necessary for survival: workshops for crafting weapons and tools, facilities for food production and storage, training grounds for developing martial skills, and living quarters designed to house extended family groups. Each stronghold was led by a chief whose authority derived not from birth or appointment, but from demonstrated strength and capability. Leadership was earned through trials that tested not just physical prowess, but also wisdom, courage, and the ability to make decisions that would benefit the entire community. This meritocratic approach ensured that stronghold leaders possessed the qualities necessary for survival in a hostile world, though it also created ongoing competition and the potential for violent succession struggles. The Orcish approach to religion reflected their transformation and their relationship with Malakath. Where other cultures might worship gods who promise protection, prosperity, or spiritual enlightenment, the Orcs venerated a deity who offered only the strength to endure hardship and the honor that comes from refusing to surrender in the face of adversity. Malakath's teachings emphasize self-reliance, the importance of keeping one's word, and the obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves. This religious perspective created a complex moral framework that sometimes put the Orcs at odds with the values of other cultures. Their absolute commitment to honor and their word meant that they would fulfill obligations even when doing so brought them no benefit or even caused them harm. Their protective instincts extended to anyone they considered under their care, regardless of whether those individuals could offer anything in return. Their refusal to back down from challenges often led to conflicts that more diplomatic cultures might have avoided. The Orcish approach to craftsmanship reflected their cultural values and their practical needs. Orcish smiths became renowned throughout Tamriel for their ability to create weapons and armor of exceptional quality and durability, but their craftsmanship was not purely functional. Orcish metalwork displayed a distinctive aesthetic that combined brutal effectiveness with an austere beauty that reflected their understanding of honor and strength. Orcish weapons were designed not just to be effective in combat, but to embody the character of their wielders. Each blade was crafted to reflect the personality and capabilities of its intended user, creating tools that served as extensions of the warrior's own nature rather than mere implements. This personal connection between smith and warrior, between tool and user, created weapons that often seemed to possess their own character and reputation. The relationship between the Orsimer and other races has been complicated by centuries of mutual misunderstanding and prejudice. Most human and elven cultures view Orcas as crude barbarians, focusing on their martial culture and their association with Malakath, while ignoring the sophisticated social structures and moral principles that govern Orcish society. This stereotyping has made it difficult for Orcs to find acceptance or recognition for their contributions to Tamrielic civilization. Conversely, many Orcs view other cultures as weak and corrupt, too concerned with comfort and appearance to maintain the strength and principles necessary for survival in a hostile world. This mutual disdain has created barriers to understanding and cooperation that persist despite occasional alliances and shared interests. Yet there have been notable exceptions to this pattern of mutual rejection. Individual Orcs who have ventured beyond their strongholds have sometimes achieved recognition and respect in other societies through their demonstration of the same qualities that their culture values: strength, honor, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. These individuals have served as bridges between Orcish and non-Orcish communities, showing that understanding and cooperation are possible when both sides are willing to look beyond surface appearances. The imperial recognition of Orsinium as a province during certain periods of history represents the most significant attempt to integrate Orcish society into the broader political structures of Tamriel. These experiments in political inclusion have had mixed results, often foundering on the fundamental differences between Orcish values and the compromises required for participation in complex diplomatic and economic systems. The repeated destruction and rebuilding of Orsinium itself tells the story of Orcish resilience and the ongoing tensions between their desire for acceptance and their refusal to compromise their essential values. Each time their capital has been destroyed by hostile neighbors, the Orcs have rebuilt it elsewhere, maintaining their commitment to creating a place where their culture can flourish without external interference. The Orcish understanding of transformation differs significantly from that of other elven peoples, where the Altmer seek to transcend their current limitations through gradual refinement, the Dunmer's ongoing change and conflict, and the Bosmer integrate with larger natural patterns. The Orc accept their transformed state as complete and permanent. They do not seek to return to their former condition as followers of Tribunal, nor do they pursue further transformation. Instead, they focus on becoming the best possible version of what they already are. This acceptance of their current state does not indicate passivity or resignation, but rather a form of wisdom that recognizes the futility of fighting against fundamental realities. The Orcs understand that their transformation was complete and irreversible, that their current nature represents not a diminishment of their former selves, but a different form of existence with its own possibilities and challenges. The Orcish approach to individual development emphasizes the cultivation of qualities that serve both personal growth and community welfare. Young Orcs are trained not just in combat skills but in the moral principles that should guide their use of strength. They learn that true power comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves, that honor is more valuable than victory, and that keeping one's word is more important than achieving one's goals. This moral education creates individuals who are simultaneously formidable warriors and principled members of their communities. Orcish culture produces people who are capable of extraordinary violence in defense of their values, but who are also governed by strict codes of conduct that limit when and how that violence can be used. The result is a society that is militaristic without being militaristic, strong without being aggressive, proud without being arrogant. The contributions of Orcish culture to the broader understanding of strength and honor extend far beyond their reputation as exceptional warriors. Their approach to community organization offers insights into how societies can maintain cohesion and purpose in the face of external hostility. Their craftsmanship demonstrates how functional excellence and aesthetic beauty can be combined in ways that serve both practical and spiritual needs. Their moral philosophy provides examples of how principles can be maintained even under extreme pressure. Perhaps most significantly, the very existence of the Orsimer demonstrates the profound capacity for transformation that exists within conscious beings. Their story shows that even the most fundamental changes, alterations that affect physical appearance, cultural practices, and religious understanding, need not destroy essential identity, but can instead create new forms of existence that are valid and valuable in their own right. The Orcish experience also illustrates the importance of community support in navigating major life transitions. The transformation that created the Orsimer would have been catastrophic for individuals facing it alone, but because it affected entire communities simultaneously, The transformed elves were able to help each other adapt to their new circumstances and develop new ways of living that honored their changed nature. As we contemplate the orcish path and its implications, we might reflect on our own experiences of transformation, on the ways that unexpected changes have shaped our understanding of ourselves and our possibilities. The Orsimer remind us that some of our greatest strengths may emerge from our most difficult experiences, that acceptance of what we cannot change can free us to focus on what we can control, and that honor and integrity are more important than external recognition or approval. Their story also speaks to the value of communities that can support us through major transitions, helping us to find meaning and purpose in circumstances we never expected to face. The orcs show us that resilience is not just an individual quality but a collective achievement, something that emerges from the mutual support and shared commitment of people who face challenges together. As we conclude our exploration of the diverse paths taken by the children of the stars, we see in the Orsimer perhaps the most dramatic example of how the descendants of the ancient Aldmer have created new forms of existence that honor their heritage while adapting to circumstances their ancestors could never have imagined. In their strength, their honor, and their unwavering commitment to their principles, the orcs embody virtues that transcend the particular circumstances of their transformation and speak to universal possibilities for growth, resilience, and the discovery of meaning in the face of adversity. The story of the elven races, from the preservationist Altmer to the transformative Dunmer, from the integrative Bosmer to the tragic Falmer, from the noble origins of the Snow Elves to the transformed strength of the Orsimer,
illustrates the remarkable diversity of responses that conscious beings can develop in the face of the fundamental challenges of existence. Each path represents not just a different culture, but a different vision of what life can be, a different answer to the eternal questions about how to find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in a complex and often difficult world.
Together, these diverse elven peoples remind us that there are many ways to live wisely, many forms that wisdom can take, and many paths that can lead to genuine achievement and understanding. Their stories encourage us to appreciate the value of different approaches to life's challenges while remaining committed to our own path of growth and development. In the end, the children of the stars teach us that our greatest achievements may come not from avoiding transformation, but from embracing it with courage, wisdom, and commitment to the values that define our deepest sense of who we are and who we aspire to become. As our journey through the diverse paths of the elven peoples comes to a peaceful close, we find ourselves with a deeper appreciation for the remarkable tapestry of existence that the children of the stars have woven across the ages, from the original unity of the ancient Aldmer to the extraordinary diversity of their descendants. We have witnessed how a single people can evolve into multiple expressions of consciousness, each finding its own way to navigate the fundamental challenges of existence. We began with the mysterious exodus from Aldmeris, that primordial homeland where the first elves experienced a perfect balance between mortal limitation and divine awareness. We followed their courageous journey to Tamriel, where the very act of seeking new challenges and possibilities began the process of transformation that would eventually give rise to all the elven cultures we know today. We explored the Altmer path of preservation and refinement, their unwavering commitment to maintaining the highest ideals of their ancestors while pursuing ever greater perfection through patient, methodical development. In their gleaming cities and ancient traditions, we saw both the nobility of high standards and the challenges that come from holding fast to ideals in a changing world. We contemplated the Dunmer embrace of transformation and conflict, their revolutionary understanding that growth comes through struggle and that wisdom emerges from the creative resolution of contradictions, from their origins as the Chimera following Veleth's teachings to their dramatic transformation under the Tribunal. We witnessed how a people can reinvent themselves while maintaining their essential identity. We discovered the Bosmer integration with the natural world, their profound understanding that individual consciousness and collective awareness need not be opposed, but can work together in harmony. Through their Green Pact with Urfrey and their participation in forest consciousness, we glimpse possibilities for existence that transcend the usual boundaries between self and world. We mourned with the tragic tale of the Falmer, whose story serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly civilization can be lost when desperation leads to dependence on those with hidden agendas. In their fall from the noble Snow Elves to the degraded creatures of the deep places, we saw the irreversible consequences of certain choices and the fragility of what we hold most dear. And we concluded with the remarkable transformation of the Orsimer, whose divine metamorphosis from followers of Trinamak to the proud, honor-bound orcs demonstrates that even the most fundamental changes can give birth to new forms of strength, wisdom, and purpose. Each of these paths represents not just a different culture, but a different answer to the eternal questions that face all conscious beings. How do we balance tradition with adaptation? How do we maintain our identity while remaining open to growth and change? How do we find meaning and purpose in the face of life's inevitable challenges? How do we relate to the larger patterns of existence while honoring our individual nature? The elven peoples show us that there are many valid responses to these questions, many ways to live with wisdom and integrity. The Aldmer remind us of the value of preserving what is precious and pursuing excellence with dedication and patience. The Dunmer teach us that growth often requires embracing rather than avoiding conflict and challenge. The Bosmer demonstrate that we can maintain our individuality while participating fully in larger patterns of consciousness and relationship. Even the tragic Falmer offer important lessons about the dangers of abandoning our deepest values in pursuit of mere survival, while the transformed Orsimer show us that strength and honor can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. As you rest now, perhaps drifting towards sleep, consider how these ancient stories might illuminate your own journey through life. Like the elven peoples, each of us faces choices about how to respond to the challenges and opportunities that come our way. We must decide what to preserve from our past and what to transform for our future. We must find ways to honor our individual nature while participating in the larger communities and relationships that give life meaning. The children of the stars remind us that there is no single right way to live, no perfect path that works for everyone. Instead, there are many possibilities, each with its own gifts and challenges, each offering its own opportunities for growth, understanding, and contribution to the larger tapestry of existence. In our next episode, Whispers of the Dwemer, we will turn our attention to perhaps the most enigmatic of all Tamriel's peoples, the Deep Elves, whose technological marvels and philosophical audacity led them to attempt something unprecedented in the history of the Elder Scrolls universe, only to vanish mysteriously at the moment of their greatest triumph. We will explore their unique approach to magic and technology, their rejection of traditional divinity, and the theories that attempt to explain their sudden disappearance from the world. Until then, may your dreams be filled with the wisdom of ages, the beauty of crystal spires reaching towards starlight, the strength of ancient forests, and the enduring hope that each new day brings opportunities for growth, understanding, and the discovery of new possibilities within ourselves. Thank you for journeying with me through these ancient tales of transformation and endurance. Sleep well, traveler, and remember that like the children of the stars, you too carry within yourself the capacity for wisdom, adaptation, and the creation of meaning in an ever-changing world.